Sleep looks like death. The chest rises and falls so faintly you have to watch for it. The eyes are closed. The body is still. For hours, we lie motionless in darkness, somewhere between the world and whatever waits beyond it. And when we wake, we return. But not everyone does. There is a story about sleep that will not let go of us. It has been told and retold for centuries. We know it from childhood. We know its rhythms. We know how it ends. A princess is born. Her parents, a king and queen, are so overjoyed that they hold a great celebration and invite the fairies of the kingdom to bless the child. But one fairy is not invited. She is old, perhaps forgotten, and when she arrives uninvited, she is angry. The other fairies offer gifts, beauty, grace, kindness, but the forgotten fairy offers something else, a curse. On her 16th birthday, the princess will prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel and fall into a sleep like death. The king tries to prevent it. He orders every spindle in the kingdom destroyed. He bans spinning wheels from the land. But fate, as the story goes, cannot be outrun. On her 16th birthday, the princess finds a hidden room. Inside is an old woman, spinning. The girl reaches out. The spindle pricks her finger. She falls. But this is not death. A younger fairy, unable to undo the curse, has softened it. The princess will not die. She will only sleep. And so will everyone in the castle. The king and queen, the servants, the guards, all of them fall into the same enchanted stillness. Around the castle, a hedge of thorns grows so thick that no one can pass. For 100 years, the castle sleeps. Then, as the story promises, a prince arrives. He cuts through the thorns. He enters the silent palace. He finds the sleeping princess, beautiful and untouched by time. He kisses her. She wakes, and so does everyone else. The curse is broken. The kingdom awakens. The prince and princess marry. The story ends as we expect it to, with love, with life, with the promise that even the deepest sleep can be undone. It is a soft story, a safe story, a story we tell children because it has a happy ending. But there is something in it that does not sit quite right. The spindle. Why a spindle? Why this particular object, this small wooden tool used for spinning thread, chosen as the instrument of a curse so powerful it could put an entire kingdom to sleep? The story insists on it. The king bans every spindle in the land. The fairy specifies it in the curse. The old woman in the tower is spinning with one when the princess finds her. It is not a sword, not a thorn, not poison in a cup. A spindle, an object so ordinary, so tied to women's work, that it seems almost invisible. And yet the story treats it as if it were a weapon, dangerous enough to be outlawed, sharp enough to draw blood, powerful enough to bring about a fate that even a king cannot prevent. In some versions, the king burns every spinning wheel in the kingdom. In others, he locks them away. But no matter how hard he tries, one remains, always one, hidden in a forgotten room, waiting. Why? The story does not say. It moves past the moment quickly, as if the spindle is only a detail, a prop, a necessary piece of the machinery of the tale. But it lingers. It insists on being noticed. Because if you stop and think about it, the choice is strange. A princess could be cursed to die in any number of ways. She could fall from a tower. She could be poisoned by a flower. She could drown, or burn, or simply vanish. But instead, the curse is tied to spinning, to a tool that women used every day, to the act of making thread, of taking raw wool or flax and turning it into something that could be woven, that could clothe, that could cover. It was not dramatic work. It was not rare. It was as common as breathing. And yet, in this story, it becomes the axis on which everything turns. There are older versions of this tale, versions where the details are different, where the princess does not wake with a kiss, where the sleep is not quite so innocent, where the ending is not quite so soft. But even in those versions, the spindle remains. It is always there, always waiting, always sharp. And if you look closely, you begin to wonder, what if the spindle was never just a detail? What if it was the point all along? What if the story is not really about a princess at all, but about the thing that pricks her? The story does not begin where we think it does. Long before the Brothers Grimm collected their fairy tales in the forests of Germany, long before anyone called her Sleeping Beauty, the story was already old, already known, already being whispered in other languages, in other kingdoms, under other names. It was never just one story. It was many. In 1634, an Italian poet named Giambattista Basile published a collection of folk tales in Naples. Among them was a story called Sun, Moon, and Talia. In it, a young noblewoman named Talia is cursed by a prophecy. A splinter of flax becomes lodged under her fingernail. She falls into a death-like sleep. Her father, unable to wake her, places her body in a palace and locks the doors. Years later, a king finds her. He does not wake her with a kiss. The details of what follows are darker than the version we know, but the structure is the same. A young woman, a forced stillness, an object that pierces her skin and sends her into sleep. 60 years later, in France, Charles Perrault retold the story. He called it La Belle au bois dormant, the beauty sleeping in the wood. This version is softer. The curse comes from a fairy. The princess pricks her finger on a spindle. She sleeps for 100 years. A prince arrives. He kisses her. She wakes. This is the version that would shape the story we know today. But Perrault did not invent it. He was writing down something already being told. The tale had already traveled, already changed, already been remembered and forgotten and remembered again. And if you go further back, the pattern grows wider still. In Norse mythology, there is a story about a Valkyrie named Brynhildr. She defies Odin, the king of the gods, and as punishment, he places her in an enchanted sleep. Around her, he raises a wall of fire that no man can cross. She lies on a mountaintop, surrounded by flames, waiting. Only the hero Sigurd is brave enough to pass through the fire. He wakes her. They fall in love. The details are different. There is no spindle, no curse from a fairy, but the shape of the story is the same. A woman is removed from the world by a supernatural force. She cannot wake herself. She lies in stillness, waiting for someone to break the spell. Someone always does. This pattern appears again and again, across centuries, across cultures, in medieval romance, in folk ballads, in oral traditions passed down through generations of storytellers who never wrote anything down. The names change, the settings shift. Sometimes the woman is a princess, sometimes a maiden, sometimes a goddess. Sometimes she is cursed, sometimes she is punished, sometimes she simply falls asleep and cannot wake. But the structure holds. A young woman on the edge of adulthood, a moment of transformation that becomes a moment of suspension, a sleep that looks like death, a stillness that must be broken by someone else. Folklorists have a term for this kind of story. They call it a tale type. It means the story is not unique. It means there is a pattern beneath the surface, a narrative structure that repeats itself across time and place, as if the same idea is being told over and over in slightly different ways. The tale type for Sleeping Beauty is classified as ATU 410. The number is dry and academic, but what it represents is something stranger. It means that from Italy to Norway, from the 1600s back through oral traditions that may stretch centuries earlier, people were telling the same story. They did not know each other. They did not share the same language or the same gods, but they told the same tale. Why? What is it about this particular story, this specific pattern that human beings needed to repeat? What made it worth remembering when so many other stories were lost? The spindle becomes a splinter. The fairy becomes a god. The hedge of thorns becomes a ring of fire. But the core remains. A young woman falls into a sleep she cannot escape. Someone must come to wake her. It is not a coincidence. It is not a random invention. It is an echo. And echoes always come from somewhere. By the time the story reached the Brothers Grimm in the early 1800s, it had already passed through centuries of retelling. It had been softened, reshaped, made safe for children. The darker details had been smoothed away. The violence had been removed. The ending had been made happy. But underneath, the structure had not changed. A young woman, a moment of stillness, a waiting. It was as if the story itself remembered something that the tellers had forgotten, as if the pattern was older than any single version, as if it was trying to preserve something that had once mattered in a way we can no longer fully understand. Because this is not one story. It is the same story, told 1,000 different ways, by people who may not have known they were repeating each other. And if that is true, then the question is not where the story came from. The question is what it was remembering. The spindle was always in a woman's hand. For thousands of years, spinning thread was women's work. From childhood through old age, women sat with raw wool or flax and twisted it into thread. It was not ceremonial. It was not rare. It was ordinary, necessary, a task repeated every day in every household, as common as breathing. But in myth, the spindle was never just a tool. In ancient Greece, the three Fates, the Moirai, spun the thread of every human life. Clotho spun the thread into being. Lachesis measured its length. Atropos cut it. The The spindle, in their hands, was not making cloth, it was making destiny. Life itself was thread, and when the thread was cut, life ended. This idea appears across cultures. In Norse mythology, the Norns wove fate at the base of the world tree. In Slavic folklore, spinning goddesses determined how long a person would live. The act of spinning was not just labor, it was magic. It was the power to create and to end. And so, when the story of Sleeping Beauty places a spindle at the center of the curse, it is not random. It is choosing the one object most closely tied to women, to creation, and to fate itself. The story tells us that the princess is cursed on the day of her birth. The fairies or the fates, depending on how far back you go, gather to bless her. But one is forgotten, one is left out, and she brings a curse instead of a blessing. On her 16th birthday, the girl will prick her finger on a spindle and fall into a sleep like death. 16. That is the age the story always returns to. The age when the curse comes true. It is not childhood. It is not adulthood. It is the threshold between them. The moment when a girl is no longer a child but not yet fully a woman. Some folklorists believe the story may reflect an older understanding of this transition. In many ancient cultures, a girl's first blood, her menarche, was seen as a kind of death. She was no longer the child she had been. Something in her had changed, something irreversible. In some traditions, girls who reached this age were isolated, removed from the community, kept in seclusion for days, weeks, sometimes months. They were not allowed to be seen, not allowed to speak. They were in a kind of sleep, a stillness between one life and the next. It was not punishment, it was ritual, and when the ritual was complete, they emerged, changed, ready to marry, to bear children, to take on the work of women. The sleep was necessary. The transformation could not happen without it. The spindle, then, may represent the moment this transformation begins. The prick of the finger, the first blood, the passage from childhood into something else. It is possible that the story was once a way of explaining this moment, a way of encoding what it meant for a girl to cross that threshold. The curse is not evil, it is simply fate. It cannot be avoided. The king can burn every spindle in the kingdom, but one will always remain. The transformation will always come, and the girl will sleep. But there is another figure in the story who demands attention, the forgotten fairy, the one who was not invited, the one who brings the curse. She is almost always old. In some versions, she is angry because she was excluded from the celebration. In others, she is simply doing what she was always meant to do. She is not kind. She is not gentle. She does not bless. She curses. Some scholars believe this figure may preserve traces of much older beliefs. In ancient mythology, there were goddesses who governed fertility, childbirth, and transformation. They were not always benevolent. They demanded respect. They demanded offerings. And if they were ignored or forgotten, they brought suffering. In Greek myth, Eileithyia was the goddess of childbirth. She could ease labor or make it unbearable. In Slavic folklore, there were spirits who watched over pregnant women and newborns, but if they were offended, they could take the child away or curse the mother. The forgotten fairy may be an echo of these older figures, a goddess diminished into a fairy tale, a spirit of transformation who once held real power, reduced to a villain in a children's story. But her role in the narrative remains the same. She is the one who brings the moment of change. She is the one who marks the threshold. Without her, there is no curse. Without the curse, there is no sleep. Without the sleep, there is no story. She is not incidental. She is necessary. To the people who first told this story, these meanings may not have been symbolic. They may have been real. The fear that a girl's body would change. The fear that she would become someone else. The fear that this transformation could go wrong, that something could be lost or damaged in the passage from childhood to womanhood. The spindle was not just a tool, it was the instrument of fate. The sleep was not just a curse, it was the unavoidable stillness that came with transformation. And the forgotten fairy was not just a villain, she was the force that governed change, and she could not be ignored. These were not metaphors, they were coherent, emotionally real explanations for something human beings have always feared, the mystery of becoming. The story did not explain that fear away. It gave it shape. It gave it a pattern. It said, "This will happen. You cannot stop it. But if you survive the sleep, you will wake, and someone will be there waiting." Stories do not survive by accident. For a tale to last centuries, it must carry something that people need, something they recognize, even if they cannot name it, something that makes them want to tell it again, to pass it forward, to keep it alive when 1,000 other stories fall silent and disappear. The story of Sleeping Beauty has survived, through oral tradition and written text, through translations and adaptations, through the collapse of empires and the rise of new ones. It has been softened and reshaped, and made safe for children, but it has never been forgotten. Why? What is it about this particular pattern, a young woman, a spindle, a forced sleep, an awakening that human beings have carried for so long? Perhaps because it speaks to something we have always understood, something about transformation, about vulnerability, about the moment when innocence ends and something else begins. The story does not offer comfort, it offers recognition. It says, there is a threshold that must be crossed. It cannot be avoided. No king can prevent it. No parent can protect you from it. The spindle will always be there, hidden in a forgotten room, waiting. And when the moment comes, you will sleep. This is not a metaphor for danger. It is a memory of what transformation felt like to the people who told this story first. The fear that something precious would be lost. The fear that the person who woke would not be the same person who fell asleep. In ancient times, the passage from childhood to adulthood was not gradual. It was marked. It was ritualized. It was a moment of rupture, and that rupture was often understood as a kind of death. Girls who reached maturity were isolated, removed from their families, kept in silence and stillness until the ritual was complete. It was believed that they needed to die as children in order to be reborn as women. The sleep was real. The transformation was real, and it was dangerous. The story of Sleeping Beauty may be an echo of that belief, a way of saying, this will happen to you. You will be taken from the world you know. You will lie in stillness, and you will not be able to wake yourself. But you will wake, and that is the promise the story makes. No matter how long the sleep, no matter how deep the stillness, no matter how overgrown the hedge of thorns becomes, someone will come, the spell will break, life will return. It is a story about survival, not about rescue, because the prince, in the oldest versions, does not save the princess. He arrives after the 100 years have passed, after the curse has already run its course. He does not break the spell breaks itself. He simply happens to be there when she wakes. What the story preserves is not the idea that women need to be saved. It is the idea that transformation, no matter how frightening, is survivable, that the sleep will end, that the stillness is temporary, that what seems like death is only waiting. This is what the story did for the people who told it. It gave shape to a fear they could not escape. It named the thing that could not be named. It said, this is what becoming feels like, and you will survive it. And so the story was remembered, told by mothers to daughters, whispered around fires, written down in books, changed and adapted and softened, but never abandoned, because the fear it addresses has never disappeared. The spindle is still there. Even now, in versions of the story where magic has been stripped away and the fairies have become symbols, the spindle remains. It is still sharp. It is still the instrument of transformation. It is still the thing that cannot be avoided. Some objects in stories carry weight beyond their function. They are not just details. They are anchors. They hold the story to something older than itself. The spindle is one of those objects. It connects the fairy tale to the Fates who spun the thread of life in ancient Greece, to the Norns who wove destiny at the base of the world tree, to the spinning goddesses of a dozen forgotten mythologies who held the power to create and to destroy. It is a tool, a weapon, a symbol of fate itself, and it has never left the story. Perhaps that is because the story is not really about a princess at all. It is about the moment when the thread is spun, when the needle pricks, when the blood is drawn, when the old life ends and the new one has not yet begun. It is about the space between, the waiting. The enchanted sleep is not a punishment, it is a passage. And the story tells us that no matter how frightening that passage is, no matter how much is lost in the crossing, the sleeper will wake. That is the truth the story carries. That is why it survived. Not because it is comforting, but because it is necessary. We still tell this story. We still know it. Even when we no longer remember what it meant, we remember the shape of it, the structure, the pattern, a young woman on the edge of transformation, a moment of stillness, a waiting, an awakening. The details have changed. The fairies have become metaphors. The spindle has become a symbol, but the core remains, because the fear remains, and the story, in its quiet way, still offers the only answer it ever had. You will sleep, you will wake, and the spindle will still be there, sharp and waiting, carrying a memory older than any of us can name.